Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversations. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said last week that if India's sovereignty is challenged, it will hit back with double the force. Every time there is an attack on India, the Indian politicians are in a habit of saying, "Hum muh tod jawab denge," or "We will give them a strong response." Has India lived up to its promise of striking back, which it issues from time to time? Or is India a soft country with a defensive military posture, unable to carry out its threats decisively and strongly? Or has India's defensive posture served it well? To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. Rajesh teaches international politics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He also teaches national and international security issues. And he is an author of two very important books, Fighting Like a Guerrilla, The Indian Army and Counterinsurgency, and Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia. And Professor Rajagopalan is known for his rather hardline and hawkish views on national security and national defense related issues. Welcome to the National Security Conversations, Professor Rajagopalan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let me begin by asking this question about India's strategic posture. You seem to argue in your writings that India has a very defensive military posture, and that you have also advocated in many ways that India should change this defensive military posture. Why do you say that? Hasn't the defensive posture, if you look at history, hasn't India's defensive posture served it well? If not, what in your opinion should be India's military posture?
Well, I think India's defensive posture is understandable has been understandable because India has been the dominant power within the region, and its neighbors are all fairly small. Even when you compare it to Pakistan, Pakistan is less than 15% of India's size and GDP and whatnot. So a defensive posture is to some extent understandable because there is not really any need for any offensive posture against fairly small states. But given that we have faced significant threats of terrorism from Pakistan, my argument is that if you when you are facing those kinds of threats, you do need to have a harder response in order to deter Pakistan. I mean, not vis-a-vis our other smaller neighbors, but specifically when it comes to terrorism in Pakistan, I think a deterrence posture is necessary, and deterrence is not possible with a purely defensive posture that we have adopted. So we need to have a somewhat more harsher response when it comes to terrorist attacks against us, primarily as a way of deterring further terrorist
Let's come to the response part later, but I want to understand in general, what do you mean when you say that India should have a less defensive posture, not in response to one country or the other, but as the personality of a state, as it were?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, I think again that is from an abstract theoretical perspective, it's understandable. But the point is that India has always allowed the conditions around India to determine India's responses instead of trying to shape that environment. So strong states will try to shape the environment around you in a way to make your life easier. We have not always tried that, whether we look at Afghanistan, whether we look at Bangladesh or Myanmar or Chinese intrusions into, or not, I wouldn't say intrusions, but Chinese presence in various parts of India's neighborhood. So in a sense, states, especially strong states, take action in order to proactively shape the environment around them, and we haven't done that. We have been more reactive. We have responded late to conditions that change around us instead of trying to change those conditions so that our life gets easier. I think that's what one would mean when you're talking about a very defensive, more than defensive, it is reactive rather than proactive effort to shape the environment around us. That's how I would define it.
Got it. But you're saying, in other words, that India needs to be a strong state and should take steps in order to shape the environment that India is in. How does India go about doing that? Are you talking about militarily shaping, or are you talking about in a domineering manner? What do you mean by that?
No, not necessarily militarily shaping it. I mean, in some cases, military responses would be required. But I'm talking about shaping it in diplomatically or economically and so on and so forth. I mean, for example, we have Gujarat doctrine, I think, was the right way to approach our neighborhood, because it was.
Professor Rajagopalan, your writings seem to indicate that you are a realist who doesn't necessarily believe in norms, principles, and peaceful coexistence. But you, quoting Gujarat doctrine, you seem to be going on a completely different trajectory altogether.
It's not. I mean, it's not that realists don't believe in norms. What realists say is that norms are shaped by power. And when you are the stronger country, you have the capacity to shape those norms. You have the capacity to shape your environment. So that, in a sense, it's not that norms are not important. It is that norms do not come up on its own. Norms come up as a consequence of your power capacity. And so when you are stronger, you have that capacity to shape those norms, and therefore you proactively do that within your neighborhood, and to the extent that you can outside of the neighborhood. But that's more difficult because your power doesn't extend that far.
Let's come to the China-India question. You have written in one of the papers recently that China is a direct military threat to India. What makes you say that? Because it is India's biggest trading partner in goods, and we have not had a war with China since 1962. So what makes you say that China is a direct military threat? And that seems to be a very strong statement.
Yeah, I mean, it is a direct military threat because they have significantly more capabilities than we do, than India does, and we have disputes across the border. I mean, in terms of where our border lies. So there is, in that sense, both the capability problem that we have vis-a-vis China, which is that they are far more capable than we are, and also we have direct disputes, which means that that capability can be converted into action whenever the border becomes active. So in a sense, you have to worry about that gross inequality in terms of the capabilities that we have, and I think that is something that we don't pay sufficient attention to.
But there's a problem. You seem to be focusing on China's capabilities, and you seem to be assuming that these capabilities necessarily translate into a military threat. You're not focusing on Chinese intentions. You're looking at capabilities and not on intentions. Why is that?
As you said, I'm a realist, and realists don't worry about intentions because intentions can change on a dime. Capabilities take a much longer time to change, and therefore what you focus on is what other people's capabilities are, not what other people's intentions are. So intentions, it will be fine, to the extent that the intentions are peaceful or friendly, that's fine. But you still have to worry about the fact that they have the capability. When those intentions change, then those capabilities become a serious threat. So what you have to do is worry about capabilities, because when the intentions change, if you didn't worry about the capabilities beforehand, you are not going to be able to change the capabilities with the same speed that intentions can change. So realists always worry about capabilities, they don't worry about intentions.
So no matter what the intentions are, if there is capability, offensive military capability, then the neighboring states should worry about that. Let me give you two examples. One is, of course, United States and Canada. The other is, say, take Germany or United Kingdom. Does Germany feel threatened by United Kingdom? Does does Canada get threatened by the American military force, or say, for example, a country like Bhutan, is it threatened by India's military force? So it doesn't automatically happen, right?
No, it does, because I'll tell you why. Those are good examples, and but the reason why those examples don't hold or can be explained from a realist perspective is what matters is which is a bigger threat, right? I mean, so you may face multiple threats, and so to the extent that Canada faces a significant threat or feels it faces a significant threat from outside the region, from the Soviet Union, for example, during the Cold War period, it allied with the United States.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but I mean that shadow of that old alliance continues, and so the same for vis-a-vis Germany or Britain or any of those countries, because they felt a stronger threat from outside that region. So it is, and I'll translate that, for example, into the South Asian situation.
Or post-Cold War, say the United States and Canada in the post-Cold War world. Canada does not feel threatened now,
yes,
but they should, according to...
No, I'm not saying that they should. Well, they don't feel threatened because there is still as part of that continuity of that Cold War alliance, there is still a sort of a common threat that they feel vis-a-vis, whether it's vis-a-vis terrorism, global terrorism, or vis-a-vis a resurgence in Russia or anything of things of that nature. But if you go back prior to the Second World War, Canadian plans, war plans, did consider the United States as a threat, right? I mean, so the neighbor was a threat. It was only post 1945 that you have the United States and Canada aligning against what they considered a bigger threat, right? I mean, so what matters, what you focus on, is your most serious threat. Now, bringing that to South Asia, to give you one example, there were several times when India and Pakistan considered joining together against a bigger threat. For example, in 1960, 61, I'm forgetting the exact date, but General the president of Pakistan at that point of time Ayub Khan at that point of time did ask India to sort of join with Pakistan, not joining in the political sense, but to deal with the threat from China, right? I mean, so the idea being that China is a threat to both India and Pakistan, and therefore we can deal with it together. Now, I'm not sure how serious that proposal was, but that suggests what might happen in South Asia if you had a bigger threat. When you face a bigger threat, it is possible that you could come together to face that particular threat. So the same thing happened in 1980, 97 and 80 after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when Mrs. Gandhi offered the same sort of deal back to Pakistan, which is say, if you're worried about the Soviet Union, we can join together to sort of deal with that threat. So if you face a bigger threat, it is possible that neighbors would come together. I mean, again, I don't think either of these were serious proposals, but nevertheless, I think that indicates to some extent
how do you use the theoretical model to explain the geopolitics in the Southern Asian region today?
I mean, I think that the Southern Asian situation has been the same for the last since 1947, in the sense that we are the dominant player. In the sense, we are roughly about 79-80% of South Asia's land, wealth, population, and that has not changed. And in fact, it might over the next decade or so become wider because of India's growth. And therefore, in a sense, we represent the primary threat to all of our neighbors. And so you see,
do they all necessarily feel that threat?
They do, and they have done repeatedly actions to balance against us. Pakistan most consistently, obviously, because they are the more capable one. But every one of our neighbors at different points of time have sought to balance against India. But the problem is that they don't have the internal capacity to balance against us. They don't have the military capacity to balance against us. So the only way that they can potentially balance against us is by through friends, through allies. And they have tried. Every one of them at different points of time have tried. But the point is that nobody is really interested in aligning with a small South Asian country against a much larger country, which could give them greater benefits, right? And therefore, most of our neighbors haven't been very lucky in being able to find allies who would come on their side against India. It's not for lack of trying on their side. Every one of them has tried. But now, of course, situation is slightly different because you have China, which is willing and able to use these countries to balance against India. And so that change to the current situation that is coming is a consequence of the fact that China, unlike earlier the United States or the Soviet Union, neither of which were interested in balancing against India, now China is interested in balancing against India, and therefore they potentially have an ally who could come on their side. And so you find a lot more activity amongst our neighbors in balancing against us, and that's perfectly understandable given India's dominance of the region.
You wrote recently, Professor Rajagopalan, that this is a central strategic problem that India faces: how to secure itself and promote its national interests in a grossly unbalanced strategic environment. So how has India gone about dealing with this situation in the past? And how should India, I think you have China in mind when you write this. Exactly. How do you think India should reimagine its balancing strategy towards China, unlike in the past?
We have never faced a situation in the past. That is one of the key things to remember. That until, as I've said just now, until from 47 until the last 10, 15, 20 years, we have been the dominant player in South Asia, and we have never faced a threat within South Asia.
But China has always had a military capability.
China had a military capability, but if you look at the gross balance of power between India and China, that begins to drift apart only in the late 80s and the mid 90s. So it's only by the mid 90s that you have the separation between India and China. Until that point of time, including when we fought and lost the war with China, China's GDP was roughly the same as our GDP, and the military capabilities are more difficult to decide because obviously it's not slightly greater economic capacity or GDP doesn't necessarily mean that you're militarily superior. So, so that part is more difficult to determine. But definitely, when you have an economy 5 times as large, then you can say that your military capacity is also greater, right? I mean, so that as that from about 1990 onwards, as you see that trend widening between the gap widening between India and China, we have become more and more concerned, right? I mean, so the situation that we face is in that sense unprecedented, because we have until now not faced a situation where we were the weaker power. It is now that full consequence of that relative weakness is coming to sort of.
So you're saying that there is a starkly unbalanced strategic environment today between India and China in the Asian region, as it were. So how do you think India should go about balancing in this sort of unbalanced strategic environment?
So we have a number of choices. I mean, one is of course you can do what you can to build up your domestic capacity, but the domestic capacity, even though domestic capacity is sufficient if it's a small difference, it is not sufficient when your difference is so vast as it is between India and China, where they are 5 times your size, and that gap is widening is something that we don't always realize. Even though India is growing slightly larger at a slightly faster pace, nevertheless, because of the larger base in terms of their size of the economy, what they're adding every year to their economy is all more than twice of what we are adding to our economy. So in a sense, that gap is continuing to widen, and it will not begin to even that widening itself will not stop.
So internal balancing is not a possibility.
Internal balancing is therefore not a possibility. We don't have the capacity to balance China internally. Well, the fact that we are a primarily defensive, we are not looking to take back Tibet or take over Tibet or anything of that nature, reduces the burden a little bit. But even with that, I think when you're talking about that balance, you're not talking just about the border. You're talking about a whole host of other things. For example, their power in multilateral institutions. So NSG was a good example, but as time goes on, their capacity to use their military and their economic power to influence other countries means that we will find ourselves on any issue that where our interests differ from China's, we will find ourselves on the defensive and isolated, right? I mean, so it is not just about the military balance on the border, it's also about the diplomatic balance, about the diplomatic capacity that it brings them when in global councils, and we will find ourselves more and more wherever we have a dispute with China on a multilateral forum. You can rest assured that we are not going to carry the day.
So friendship with China is not the answer.
Well, I mean, friendship with China is difficult given that partly given that the capacity is vastly different, but also given their own attitude. I mean, so that both of that matters. But the point is that ultimately, even the only way you can be friends is if you accept to be their, essentially a vassal state, as a subordinate state, and so that is not a condition that I would want for India, and that's not a condition that most Indians would want for India, or Indian leaders would want for India. Hopefully not. So in that sense, there is no equality within Chinese worldview. They are the dominant power, as a number of scholars have
just
pointed
like
out.
India is the dominant power in South Asia in the Indian view.
Absolutely, India is the dominant, but except that in the Indian case, I don't think that came with an attitude. It came with a certain amount of arrogance and certain amount of lack of concern about our neighbors, but it didn't come with a central strategic culture which saw India as the natural hegemon of the region or anything of that nature, whereas China's strategic culture comes with that idea that they are the center of the world, and that everybody else has to pay obeisance to them, and so that part.
So coming back to this China question one last time, so your
internal balancing is not possible.
So what is
the alternatives are basically regional balancing with other countries like Japan, Australia, Singapore, Vietnam, and we are doing that. I mean, we are doing a significant part of that, but ultimately that also is going to be difficult, because even with all of these countries put together, China is stronger than all of them put together. So we have this concept in security studies, which is called the security curve, which is that if one country has more than 50% of the GDP or military capacity within a particular system, then it is impossible, obviously to balance against them because they have more capacity than everybody else put together. And China has reached that security curve, over that security curve. So which means basically that even if everybody combines, which is itself difficult, it is going to be very, very difficult to balance against China, which means the only way to balance against China is to find another country which has more capacity than China, which is the United States. And so the only way in which we can potentially balance against China is with in a partnership with the United States, right? I mean, because they are the only country in the whole world which has that capacity, and they also have the desire to balance against China for their own reasons.
Right, your point is well taken. That is the only way that you can balance against the Chinese power in the region is to gang up with the United States. I'll come to the Indo-US relations in a bit, but before that I sort of want to draw your attention to India-Pakistan relations, on which you've written quite a lot. You wrote in March this year, for instance, that the almost daily cross-border firing on the line of control and frequent terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir are clear indicators that India's current deterrence strategy against Pakistan has failed. The reasons are not hard to find. New Delhi's fear of escalation is now so well established that Pakistan has little reason to be deterred by any Indian threats. You went on to add, as long as India continues to fear escalation, it has little chance of deterring Pakistan's support for cross-border terrorism. Are you saying that there is no concern for escalation? How does that argument hold in a nuclearized scenario like we have in South Asia?
I've been writing that for several years, so I mean I fully subscribe to that point, which is basically that the point is that escalation is something that is a useful excuse for Pakistan, for other interested parties around the world.
Are you saying it's not a reality?
It's not a reality.
It's not a possibility at all?
I wouldn't say it's not a possibility at all, but it is highly unlikely, and escalation actually helps us, because how does a country that is far weaker than us escalate against us? That makes no sense whatsoever. Right? I mean, the possibility that a weaker power can escalate against a stronger power makes no logical sense. Right? I mean, the only way they can escalate is by obviously nuclear weapons. But there are several steps before you get to the nuclear level. I mean, so it's not as if they're going to escalate to the nuclear level at the first sign of trouble. I mean, right? I mean, they have to first lose a conventional war, and even if they lose a conventional war, they have to the excuse for using nuclear weapons would have to be an injury of a significant injury. I mean, what kind of significant injury can we cause Pakistan that would force them to reach for the nukes? The idea that if we go a couple of kilometers into Pakistani territory, they will start using nukes is an absurd argument. Because it is
but it's also a reality that Pakistan army is not a weak army. It's a strong army, and it has trained all its life preparing for a situation of this kind. So if India escalates into the Pakistani occupied Kashmir, then the Pakistanis will try and encroach into the Indian side in a different location. And clearly, for at least for a week or 10 days, Pakistani army will be able to withstand an Indian aggression or counter attack India. What happens thereafter in your sort of estimate?
There is no scenario, and this other people have told them. I mean, this I'm sort of quoting from what the Americans told the Pakistanis in the 1990 crisis, I think, if I recall correctly. That they have gamed it multiple times, and you can game it yourself in the sense that what scenario allows a country that is so much weaker than India to win a war against India? There is no way on earth that can happen, because the imbalance of power, some of our capabilities deteriorate. In some cases, we need better training, or we need better equipment. Or all of those things are true. We need to have better stocks. All of those things are true. But even with all of those weakness, we are still a far stronger country, in militarily speaking, than Pakistan.
Conventionally speaking.
Conventionally speaking, yeah.
What if there is, say, for example, there are talks about tactical nuclear weapons being developed by the Pakistani side. They may decide when the push comes to shove to pre-delegate the authorization of those tactical nuclear weapons against invading forces. And if there is a folder gap, like sort of trigger situation where they say that up to this point, and we have deployed tactical nuclear weapons and they are in the hands of the local commanders, You come beyond that, and this is, you are initiating a nuclear crisis. How did India respond to that kind of a
Yeah,
situation?
I mean, so there is the idea that you have a situation where Pakistan delegates its authority. They haven't done that so far, right? I mean, so to some extent that would be going against what they have done so far, which was keep these weapons centralized, even though they are tactical nuclear weapons. To the best of our knowledge, these are not delegated to lower level commands. Definitely not to the division command.
But that doesn't take away from the fact that it might in future be pre-delegated.
Well, there is a lot of things that they might do. We can't sort of obviously go on the basis of what they might do. They could also start a full-scale nuclear war. I mean, but the point is,
but you got to game all of these things.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. So when you game all those things, you don't sort of you have to look at the probability of what would their calculation be, right? I mean, so if you're looking at the calculation that they have, how would it help them to use tactical nuclear weapons if you are a few kilometers inside Pakistani territory, or even better for us if you are inside Pakistan occupied Kashmir. POK, so the idea that they would use nuclear weapons of any kind, tactical or otherwise, in POK, I find kind of fundamentally incredible. I mean, so credible deterrence
but as a deterrence theorist, you would also consider the fact that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is itself enough to dissuade a country from initiating a war.
So I think the link between conventional and nuclear is what matters. During the Cold War period, that link was very tight. So any war that began at the conventional level would very easily escalate to the nuclear level, and that was the reason why both sides took enormous effort to ensure that even a conventional war didn't start, because of the tight linkage between conventional and nuclear war. Simply because the forces were structured in such a way that they had to be ready to go in a very short time, in half an hour, they had to be ready to launch nuclear attacks on each other. That is not how small nuclear forces are structured. Small nuclear forces are structured with far greater political control. They have to be only used deliberately. They cannot be used by.
But the fact that the Pakistanis have developed tactical nuclear weapons indicates a certain intent behind this.
Their intent is to deter us. I mean, so that intent is. I mean, what they're doing makes perfect sense as a deterrent strategy, right? It makes no sense when it comes to actual use, because if as a deterrent strategy, if they can scare us, their interest is in scaring us with escalation. So that we don't escalate, right? I mean, that is perfectly understandable, given that they are conventionally the weaker power, and therefore they have to depend on nuclear escalation to threaten us with escalation, because conventional escalation wouldn't threaten us. I mean, if they simply said, oh, if you attack one place, we will attack another place, which was, for example, India's deterrent strategy in the 1950s and what we did in 1965, because our deterrent strategy was basically to say that if you attack in Kashmir, we'll attack in the plains, right? That made sense for a stronger power. It doesn't make sense for a weaker power.
So you're saying that nuclear weapons, Pakistani nuclear weapons, do not alter the situation between.
It doesn't alter the situation, because it makes sense for them to make the threat. But under how do they win a conventional a nuclear escalatory strategy? It makes no sense, because you're losing, let's say, Hajipur Pass. That works as long as deterrence works. I'm talking about going beyond that, right? I mean, so that's why I'm saying that their deterrent strategy is perfect, right? In the sense that their deterrent strategy is based on nuclear escalation. I'm saying it doesn't make any sense for them to actually carry out that threat, right? So
the threat is good enough.
No, the threat. So if you believe that threat, that's good enough, right? I mean, so what I'm saying is that if India were to ignore that threat and escalate, right, then their strategy is basically collapses. Right? I mean, so basically their idea that that somehow they will escalate to get out of that situation doesn't make any sense when it comes to actual use. It makes sense to threaten that. It doesn't make any sense to actually use that. That's my point. Right. And as long as you recognize that it doesn't make any sense for them to use it, you can actually escalate.
Okay, so let me understand this. You are saying that if there is a Mumbai-like attack once again, India should completely disregard the nuclear bluff that has been posed by the Pakistanis and should go ahead and carry out a conventional strike against Pakistan, be it in Kashmir or in the plains.
I would say Kashmir, but I mean, I'm fine with wherever. But the reason why it's Kashmir is because you don't have to give the territory back. I mean, unlike the plains where it's not your territory, we are not claiming the territory, so we'll have to give it back. So I would prefer.
What retaliation do you expect from this kind of a strike by the Indian side in the first place?
I mean, they will try to defend themselves, but beyond that, I wouldn't expect any further retaliation in the sense that they would have to. The threat that you would have to hold out is that any further attack by Pakistan would also meet with further escalation, because as a stronger power, once again, India controls that escalation ladder, and it is time that India use that escalation ladder. It's time India sort of stop worrying about Pakistani escalation, because let Pakistan worry about Indian escalation. Because if you are talking about a purely deterrence level, one reason why that deterrence works is because we have essentially given credibility to the notion that Pakistan will escalate. We haven't really examined the question of how and why they would escalate, right? I mean, so that
In fact, you've gone on you've argued in the past that India should show the willingness to initiate escalation every time an opportunity presented itself. In other words, India should unilaterally escalate vis-a-vis Pakistan as and when it deems fit. On the question of surgical strikes, that you have written that the promise of punishment, there should be a promise of punishment that will be unacceptable to the adversary, in this case Pakistan. So you are making the argument that no matter what their strategies are, no matter what you think they would respond militarily, you should go ahead and capture the moment and strike militarily unilaterally.
I would. The point is that in the considering that India is a stronger side, what the country that has to worry is Pakistan. But paradoxically, we have the stronger country worrying about escalation. To me, that is just absurd. I mean, so it's a stronger country as to worry about escalation, then there is something wrong with the way the stronger country.
Do you think the Indian political leadership and the military leadership has the gumption and the stomach to unilaterally escalate militarily against Pakistan?
Well, so far they haven't shown any. So I mean, it's not. I mean, I wouldn't say military leaders, because obviously these are political decisions, and in India definitely it's a political leadership that makes those decisions, and they haven't shown that sort of spine for a long time in order to be able to sort of deal with this problem. I mean, I would think that over a period of time we would have thought through about the consequences and how to sort of deal with the problem that Pakistan poses these, but we haven't really done that thinking.
Let's look at a different scenario. Just like India may tie up with the United States in order to check China, Pakistan is clearly in a close strategic partnership with the Chinese in order to check India in the region. Now, the Sino-Pakistan relationship has been increasing at every sense of the term, including with the Chinese soldiers or Chinese people on the ground in Pakistan. So an Indian escalation, military escalation towards Pakistan, that may invite some sort of a response from China, or you don't foresee that at all?
I mean, we can think about all sorts of excuses for not doing anything, and you can come up with.
But that's a real possibility.
It's not a possibility, because if Chinese citizens find themselves in a war zone, that's their problem. That's not our problem. Right? I mean, it's not if Chinese citizens found themselves in Afghanistan while Afghanistan was being bombed by the United States, I don't think the US was going to stop bombing because Chinese citizens were there, or any other situation. Right? I mean, there have been all sorts of wars.
We are not the United States of America.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it's not. The point is that we cannot allow the possibility that somebody else might get involved, or somebody else might be there, happen to be there, and therefore,
well, I mean, the scenario building or gaming has to involve all these.
You can game it for all you want, but my point basically is that irrespective of how you game it, this should not stop any action, right? I mean, so I don't see China, for example, taking the same consideration about our interests. They are building a highway on territory that they know is disputed, that they know is claimed by us. So when they don't give any consideration to our concerns, I see little reason to give any sort of any consideration to their responses. So, but more importantly, I think that would matter. I mean, the Chinese. It depends on which Chinese are there in that territory, right? I mean, if they are Chinese citizens who are, let's say, hiking in the Himalayas there, I mean, that's different.
Or military persons.
If military personnel are hiking in the Himalayas, it doesn't make any difference, right? If there are actual military forces, let's say a battalion deployed there, that means something else. Now, is it because of a Chinese Pakistani secret military treaty that we don't know about. Those things matter. If China and Pakistan are aligned formally in a military agreement, then we will have to consider that possibility. Then I would.
No.
Sorry?
Until then, no.
Until then, no. Right? I mean, if they are aligned, then we have to consider the possibility that any action that we take on one side will need to worry about what action China might take against us.
Let's come to the country that you think is potentially the answer to all our problems, the United States of America. On the Indo-US partnership, you've written that a closer alignment with the United States further along the same policy path that India is already pursuing represents the best way to meet the challenge of India's rise, because the United States is the only power that is stronger than China. Further, New Delhi and Washington share a common interest in balancing Beijing. But how can an offshore declining superpower help India meet a next door challenge which is growing on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, declining is sort of relative.
Offshore is not.
Offshore is not, but offshore is actually helps, because just like the fact that our neighbors will take help from what might be characterized as offshore, which is basically China, to balance against India. What matters is whether they are the closer they are, the more of a threat they are, right? I mean, the farther away, the more of help they are. So in that
But the less
sense,
interest they have,
that is the possibility.
they are,
That is definitely a possibility. So you'll have to. It works only if the United States is also interested. So to the extent that the United States, if the US is not interested, then of course it doesn't help.
So the question then is, will the United States stand by India should there be a confrontation, military or otherwise, between India and China, just like they did not stand by India or did almost nothing during the Doklam crisis?
Well, Doklam crisis, they did stand by us in more than one way, in the sense that there were statements that were made, I mean, but they were reasonably, I understand that they were not very aggressive with those statements, but then neither was our diplomacy very aggressive during that period of time. You can't expect the United States to take action harsher than the statements that we put out during that time. So we were taking an extremely calm, quiet approach diplomatically vis-a-vis China, and the Chinese, if you look at the American statements during that period of time, they were more or less the same. I mean, very similar to that. The more important part is that the United States did provide very vital intelligence during that period of time, of which we have reports. One of the reasons why supposedly, I mean, Comcasa became so easy was because we suddenly realized after last year's experience that their assistance is vital, because they were able to give us intelligence about Chinese troop movements which we couldn't get on our own. And so that sort of, but then that also, according to these reports at least, because we didn't have an agreement signed already, it was somewhat difficult because it had to go through various filters, and whereas with those agreements, it will be easier for us to get those intelligence. So it's not entirely accurate to say that they didn't support us, but more importantly, it also depends on what kind of relationship we have, in the sense that if we are a military ally, then we should expect them to come to our assistance with military force, but then we should also expect to go to their assistance militarily. If we are talking, if you are not willing to do that, then you can't expect them to. There are no free lunches in international politics, as you know. It's entirely our choice. I mean, but then the question is, you have to make a decision about what is in your interest, right? I mean, is Iran such a fantastic strategic catch that you're willing to sacrifice the United States for it? I mean, if we think that it is, then we should definitely go with Iran. I mean, to me, it makes no sense to when you put the scales between Iran and the United States, to even think that they're on the same planet. I would find it difficult to, so the point is basically, you're free to you can choose. I mean, if you choose on the basis of which provides you better alternative, right? I mean, so to say that we are a free country, we will do whatever we want. I mean, we are a sovereign country, yeah, we do whatever you want. I mean, but then don't expect others to also not do whatever they want.
Professor Rajagopalan, my last question, and that is about what advice, and you've been my PhD advisor too, but what advice would you give to the government of India in order to shape up its defense posture? What kind of posture should it adopt, and where are we now, and what is lacking? Very briefly.
That's a very large question, but I mean, the point is that you will have to begin with not just the posture, but in terms of having closer communication between the civilians and the military. It doesn't have to be through CDS, or it can be through CDS or whatever. But the point is that we, as of now, we do have, as several scholars have pointed out, we do have a significant problem with civil-military relations. I think that is the beginning part, because both the military and the civilians need to know what each other is capable. The civilians need to know what their military is capable of, and what the military needs to know is what the civilians want to do with the military. So that, I think, that communication is missing, and I think that's the starting point. And then there's a whole host of things which I don't think we have enough time to go into, but everything from the size of the army to the kind of balance between different services, all of those need to be changed considering the challenges that we face. For example, we have the world's largest army as of now, which is absurd. I mean, we don't need this large an army. A lot of the counterinsurgency tasks can be done by other forces. And so there is a whole host of things that I would think that we can do as far as changing the Indian post service goes. But like I said, we'll don't have enough time to go into all of that.
Professor Rajagopalan, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.